All right, so we've had all different configurations. I'm going to pioneer the table plus PowerPoint method. Just before I start, this paper has 18 footnotes. If anybody wants them, just email me and I'll send you a copy of the paper, okay? So when I was a teenager, I read 4 works of literature that would have a lasting impact on me to this day. The first was George Orwell's 1984, which I read in one sitting, and then, when I finished, I started the whole thing again. I remember it left me stunned. I walked about, dazed for days on end. It had a real impact. The second was Anthony Burgess's A Clockwork Orange, which is ultimately a book about the importance of free will in moral decision-making. The third was Arthur Miller's The Crucible, a play about the Salem witch trials in which the protagonist is coerced to confess that he has consorted with the devil. And the fourth was Harold Pinter's The Birthday Party, which ends with the immortal line, "Stan, don't let them tell you what to do." So on reflection, I think that these works of literature inoculated me against the various ideologies of totalitarianism, and perhaps I was primed from that time onwards to become a classical liberal or libertarian thereafter. Now, one common thread in these works is the relationship between language and power. Of course, this is most developed in Orwell. If you recall, in 1984, the subjects of Big Brother were required, through a process of doublethink and newspeak, to reject obvious and self-evident truths, such as 2 + 2 = 4, in favour of false dogma, such as 2 + 2 = 5. Here, language is simply a function of state control, and reality is whatever official doctrine dictates. I do not think it is hyperbolic to suggest that this has some contemporary relevance in the case of Joanna's family unit, quite literally. In the culture war in which we are currently engaged, the first battle to win is the language game. This comes prior to all other issues. So today, I want to focus on how our adversaries, the enemies of liberty, have succeeded in committing linguistic terrorism. And there are 4 tactics employed in the language game on which I'd like to focus. These tactics are: number 1, linguistic inversion; number 2, the mottebailey; number 3, gaslighting; number 4, the Kafka trap. However, before that, I need to clarify who we are talking about. Who are the players of this game, and why do they play it? Now, any regime in any regime, there is a ruling class made up of elites. Vilfredo Pareto distinguished between a governing elite comprising individuals who directly or indirectly play a considerable part in government, and a non-governing elite comprising the rest. The elite falls into 2 parts, he says: a minority ruling primarily by force, and a majority neither able nor inclined to use force. As James Burnham put it, the ruling class consists of those who are in the highest and the key positions of society, that's the government, and a much larger group of secondary figures, a middle class as it could properly be called, who, though not so prominent, nor not so much in the limelight, constitute the day-by-day active directors of community life. He has in mind priests, writers, journalists, academics, teachers, middle managers of all kinds. Ultimately, this secondary level of the ruling class, in the long run at least, is more decisive than those at the very top. It is this secondary level, the non-governing elite, who attempt to police thought itself. And we have seen in very recent memory how this non-governing elite react if popular votes throw up results that are not to their taste. In 2016, the people of the United Kingdom voted for Brexit, the withdrawal from the European Union, and the people of the United States voted for Donald Trump to become president. As of right now, in May 2019, it could not be clearer in either country that the establishment, that is the non-governing elite, have sought at every turn to delegitimize or overturn these results. Now, why should career politicians, career bureaucrats in the civil service, career intellectuals who work as journalists and academics be so resolutely opposed to popular revolts that directly challenge their own influence and power? Well, let me think. Their incentives could not be clearer. And it is precisely because of these incentives that the enemies of liberty have nearly always been the cheerleaders of state control. They are nearly always intellectuals for whom market demand is perennially low, present company excluded, of course. The market, of course, is an intrinsically bottom-up phenomenon which no one planned or designed. The intellectuals, in their hubris, fancy they may be able to do better through their allegedly superior insight. They imagine the economy to be an engineering problem or a puzzle to be solved from the top down. They imagine they can foresee and therefore plan better outcomes for millions of people on their behalf. After all, they are intellectuals, so it stands to reason that they must know better. And Peter Saunders summed this up best. He said, "Nobody planned the global capitalist system, nobody runs it, and nobody really comprehends it. This particularly offends intellectuals, for capitalism renders them redundant. It gets on perfectly well without them. It does not need them to make it run, or to coordinate it, or to redesign it. The intellectual critics of capitalism believe they know what is good for us, but millions of people interacting in the marketplace keep rebuffing them." So the intellectual writes furious articles, gives sermons on the Mount, lambasting his or her fellow individuals that something must be done. Invariably, what they mean is that the separate interests of all other individuals should be overridden by their own wants and desires with the use of coercion and force if necessary. Now, as George Orwell wrote in 1946, intellectuals look towards the USSR and see in it, or think they see, a system which eliminates the upper class, keeps the working class in its place, and hands unlimited power to people very similar to themselves. It was only after the Soviet regime became unmistakably totalitarian that English intellectuals in large numbers began to show an interest in it. Intellectuals, therefore, have some options artificially to increase their market value. They can gain employment, prestige, and power for themselves as apologists for the current regime. Now, they can present themselves ostensibly as vocal critics of the current regime, who end up nonetheless advocating for expanding its possible jurisdiction. You know, this is the left in all countries. Or they can become lobbyists for special interest groups. Now, the benefits of doing this are high: money, prestige, prizes, being lauded in The Guardian, and so on. And the costs are next to nil because, as Nassim Nicholas Taleb has put it, they have no skin in the game. Or as Thomas Sowell said, they pay no price for being wrong because there is little to no consequential feedback when they are wrong, no matter how wrong or for how long. Indeed, they are insulated from material consequences and enjoy immunity from even a loss of reputation from having been demonstrably wrong. And if you'd like to see some evidence of this claim, these are various elites. I will draw your attention to the statements of a certain Owen Jones, whose vocal support for Hugo Chavez in Venezuela cost him neither his job nor his reputation. That is, he is still employed by The Guardian and is regularly invited onto the BBC. While he pays no price, real Venezuelans continue to pay with their lives. Now, however, I should note, and this is very important, it is not only Owen Jones, The Guardian, or the Labour Party who are culpable for this, but the whole class of the non-ruling elites. Here in Britain, that means The Times, the Daily Telegraph, even the Daily Mail, and especially the Conservative Party. More on this later. Now, the great economist Joseph Schumpeter observed, Intellectuals are in fact people who wield the power of the spoken word and the written word, and one of the touches that distinguishes them from other people who do the same is the absence of direct responsibility for practical affairs. Their primary talent is linguistic. They exert control in the flow of information and in the dissemination of ideas. Now, one of the interesting things to note is that intellectuals have continually downplayed the importance of ideas to history, preferring instead vulgar, materialist explanations. Thus, popular revolts against their own increasingly corrupt regimes become, in their hands, yet more evidence of structural inequality, yet more evidence that something must be done. Only an intellectual could perform the mental gymnastics required to look at the yellow vests in France and conclude that what we really need is yet more social democracy, which is precisely what most of them do. It is striking that the collapse of the centre-left around Europe has yielded precisely 0 lessons for the entrenched non-governing elite. Anyway, as I have suggested, the enemies of liberty do not deal in clear definitions or rational argumentation. Instead, they deal in obfuscation, doublespeak, and smears. So let me return to the 4 tactics that I mentioned earlier and move through how some of these work. So the first is linguistic inversion. This is when words are defined to mean the exact opposite of their everyday meaning. So let's take a phrase like justice. In everyday English, most people take justice to mean something like reciprocal just desserts. This relies on equality under the rule of law. In other words, everyone is subject to the same rules, and this is fairness. But modify it with the word social to form the phrase social justice, and what we are left with is an idea that certain groups should get special exemptions or privileges. In other words, the complete opposite of what the vast majority of people take the word justice to mean. Therefore, virtually every social justice policy is unjust and unfair. For example, the Macpherson Report's famous call to end colourblind policing, now usually called racially sensitive policing, literally means that different ethnic groups must be treated differently by the police. Well, how well has that gone? I need only mention the town of Rotherham to tell you. Then there's affirmative action. In other words, the blatant lowering of entry requirements for certain groups. And despite initial claims that such measures will only be temporary, and reams of evidence that it has had bad effects wherever it has been tried all around the world, the policy persists, especially in the American education system. And we might go on and on. You can pick your own favourite social justice policies. Another example of linguistic inversion is, dare I say it, the language of human rights. Now, it is one thing to say that I have a human right not to be punched in the face by you, but quite another to say that I have a human right for you to give me food, shelter, custom, and so on. As Paul L. Praro put it in 1962, human rights are more properly defined as special privileges conferred upon some persons at the expense of others. Most of what are called human rights are actually entitlements without obligations. So if you were faced with someone playing these language games in a debate or even in private conversations, I recommend fully spelling out in plain English what they mean every single time the phrase is uttered. Now, this may sound pedantic, but I think it's very important to expose the linguistic concealment involved and to force the person using it actually to think about what they're saying. Continually ask for clarification. For example, if someone ever uses the phrase consumerism, I will always ask them, do you mean individuals buying products that they want at affordable price points? Now, given that most people in most places would not support the policies of the enemies of liberty if they were stripped of the emotive and concealed terms in which they are usually packaged, they rely on a second technique, a form of hoodwinking, which we can call the mottebailey. Now, this technique essentially relies on the gap between the everyday meaning of the word, let's say justice, and the more esoteric meaning, as in social justice. The first is the stronger position, the mott. The second is the weaker position, the bailey. Now, nobody is going to come out and say that they are against justice. Everyone is for justice. That is, all individuals being treated the same under the law. Very few people are for social justice. That is, some groups being treated differently under the law for whatever reason. So intellectuals rely on this gap to gain support from their unsuspecting marks. However, occasionally, a wily opponent may point this out in a debate, and you will see the intellectual, almost always a creature of cowardice, retreat to the first definition of justice as a kind of cover. Then later they quietly shift back to the second definition when they think nobody's looking. Now, such maneuverings can be seen very often around the word racism, which in everyday parlance is defined as something like discrimination or prejudice based on race, but in the esoteric lexicon of the intellectual is defined as prejudice plus power. And this is a classic mottebailey which can be witnessed virtually every day on CNN or in the tweets of David Lammy. However, much more difficult examples abound of the mottebailey. Let's take, for example, progress. This is much more subtle, much more subtle. Again, everyone is for progress. Even Edmund Burke was for progress. All but the least sensible of us can agree where progress has been made in technological areas. For example, the combine harvester produces a greater output per unit of input than an ox with a plough. This represents a saving of time and effort, which we can call progress. Similarly, if we look at the average wages measured in time to produce an hour of light, these figures are taken from Matt Ridley, by the way, no one would doubt that we have made progress in the area of how long it produced, in the area of light. Very good. However, and this is the mot, by the way, this is the strong definition of progress. However, on moral and social issues, it is less clear. For example, it's less clear that the social policies of Tony Blair and their after effects count as progress. Does anyone really think that the change of values from Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica to the right-on values of Tony Blair is progress? Well, they might. But the point is that unlike the development of the light bulb, this is much more strongly debatable and a matter of some contention. And this is the Bailey, the weaker version of progress. So when intellectuals use progress, they are often relying on this gap between the development towards a more advanced condition and what they really mean, which is a social or political change in the direction that we like. Okay? Now, why do intellectuals play this Mott-and-Bailey game to sell their ideas? It is because, in virtually every case, they must conceal the fact that they are making an active bid for power and control. If these bids were made plainly, they would be rejected by most people. So they must be concealed in this way. And the best way to deal with this, if you're ever up against the Mott-and-Bailey, is to call it out and to force them to defend the Bailey position, not the Mott position. And you may see the members of your audience, come towards your side. The third thing I want to talk about is gaslighting. Now, this is a term from psychology, and it's a technique of manipulation to achieve power. I actually think it originally comes out of the language of domestic violence. I'm not going to read through all of these. You can. These are 11 warning signs that you're being gaslit, okay? You might spend a long time on any one of them, but the most prevalent form of gaslighting I've seen in the media over the past few years has been the way in which they will persistently present an extreme, fringe, and radical view held by a tiny minority of people as being in some way representative of what the vast majority of people think, and by the same token, presenting views that are genuinely representative of a majority of people as being at the extreme fringes of allowable opinion. This is a persistent technique on our very own BBC, and it can be seen across a range of issues, from Brexit to how seriously we should take the views of a 16-year-old from Sweden on climate change. And there are a number of studies which have shown evidence of this. In Douglas Murray's Strange Death of Europe, he showed the very wide gap between audiences whooping and cheering in 2011 for mass immigration on Question Time, when opinion polls show that the majority of people consistently opposed it. And David Goodhart, who was here yesterday, using data from the British Social Attitude Survey, suggests that this tendency has gone on for many, many years. Peter Hitchens recounts an episode, a long-forgotten episode from 1967, in which the Rolling Stones were charged for various drug offences and Keith Richards was imprisoned for a year. Now, a poll at the time showed that 56% of the population aged between 21 and 34 thought that the sentence was not harsh enough, while only 12% thought that it was too harsh. Yet it was the view of the 12% that was amplified by the media and indeed the eternally right-on Tory party. I think it was even Jacob Rees-Mogg's dad who made the argument at the time. So, you know, the 12% was seen as morally normative is the point. It could not be clearer then that wittingly or otherwise, the intellectuals used state institutions, the media, schools, universities, as vehicles for ideological indoctrination in much the manner described by the Marxist philosopher Louis Althusser, and he is the mentor of Michel Foucault. He was Michel Foucault's teacher in Paris. And Althusser is a thinker that virtually all university graduates who later make up the ranks of the intellectuals are expected to read, specifically his essay, Ideology and the Ideological State Apparatus. This also explains the persistent belief among the non-ruling elite that voters must have been tricked or brainwashed somehow into supporting Brexit or Donald Trump. It cannot possibly be that their own ideas are being vocalized by someone with a platform, or that voters simply agree with what they're hearing. It must be explained away as the victims of propaganda. And naturally, this is pure projection on their part, because this is precisely what they need to do in order to gain support. And finally, I'll bring us on to the Kafka trap. When all else fails, the intellectual must resort to this. This is a preemptive verbal strike at their opponent designed to avoid actually discussing the issues at stake. Many people in this room, in fact, most of you, have been the victims of this. The Kafka trap involves a serious smear of some kind, usually accompanied by a label and an accusation: racist, sexist, homophobic, far right, and so on. Structurally, it is identical to the accusation faced by John Proctor in The Crucible. He is accused of consorting with the devil by Judge Danforth, who is essentially a witch-finder general. And this is a trap, because there is no direct answer to the accusation. If you deny it, it is affirmation that you did indeed consort with the devil, and you must be burnt at the stake accordingly. In fact, the more you deny it, the further you appear to be guilty. If you affirm it, let's say with a confession and an apology, then you did indeed consort with the devil, and you must be burnt at the stake accordingly. There is no way out of this if you give moral authority to the accuser. Okay? Now, the technique is used to move the argument from the area of logos, that is, reason and logic, where intellectuals, despite their reputation, are usually very weak, to ethos, that is, the moral character of the opponent. And in fact, the last paper talked directly about this. Now, many writers from the past, let's say Shakespeare, would have instantly recognized these moves. And that is because, as part of their education, they were trained in rhetoric and in logic. They could tell logos, ethos, and pathos apart. However, as far as I can see, our state education system, despite repeated claims to teach critical thinking, does not teach logic or argumentation at any point. I suppose that is progress for you. And so people today are just as susceptible to these techniques as the crowds who are swayed by Mark Antony's rhetoric in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. So how must we counter, how can we counter this particular form of linguistic terrorism, the Kafka trap? As we have seen from the conduct of a certain New Statesman journalist recently, the enemies of liberty pull no punches. They think nothing of destroying lives. There is no limit to how low they will stoop in pursuit of their own careers, which they have the temerity to dress up as an anointed vision. The ends justify any and every means. And therefore, their opponents, who represent the biggest threat to their continued hegemony, must be ritually purged from polite society. Now, there is no way to counter the Kafka trap, as I said, if you submit to the moral authority of the accusers. The only form of defense here is to deny the moral authority and to go on the attack. And this is where I think our very own Douglas has shown us the way in the past few weeks. When he defended Sir Roger Scruton, he did it with an attack on George Eaton, who he proved to be a liar and a slanderer. The ever-supine Tory party, meanwhile, caves to every accusation, and that is because, if it is not already obvious, there is virtually no difference between them and the Labour Party or any other corner of the ruling class, and there hasn't been since about the mid-1960s, and I'll stop there. Thank you very much.